Chapter 36 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was fear that Nelly Lebrun felt first of all. It was fear because the impossible had happened and the immovable object had been at last moved. Going back to her own room, the record of Lord Nick flashed across her mind, one long series of thrilling deeds. He had been a great and widely known figure on the mountain desert, while she herself was no more than a girl. When she first met him, she had been prepared for the sight of a fire-breathing monster, and she had never quite recovered from the first thrill of finding him not devil but man. Quite oddly, now that there seemed to be another man as powerful as Lord Nick, or even more terrible, she felt for the big man more tenderly than ever, for like all women, there was a corner of her heart into which she wished to receive a thing she could cherish and protect. Lord Nick, the invincible, had seemed without any real need for other human beings. His love for her had seemed unreal because his need of her seemed a superficial thing. Now that he was in sorrow and defeat, she suddenly visualized a Lord Nick to whom she could truly be a helpmate. Tears came to her eyes at the thought. Yet, very contradictorily and very humanly, the moment she was in her room, she began preparing her toilet for that evening at Lebrun's. Let no one think that she was already preparing to cast Lord Nick away and turn to the new star in the sky of the mountain desert. By no means. No doubt her own heart was not quite clear to Nelly. Indeed, she had put on her most lovely gown with a desire for revenge. If Lord Nick had been humbled by this singular Donnegan, would it not be a perfect revenge to bring Donnegan himself to her feet? Would it not be a joy to see him turn pale under her smile, and then, when he was well nigh on his knees, spurn the love which he offered her? She set her teeth, and her eyes gleamed with the thought, but nevertheless she went on lavishing care in the preparation for that night. As she visioned the scene, the many curious eyes that watched her with Donnegan, the keen envy in the faces of the women, the cold watchfulness of the men, were what she pictured. In a way, she almost regretted that she was admired by such fighting men, Landis, Lord Nick, and now Donnegan, who frightened away the rank and file of other would-be admirers. But it was a pang which she could readily control and subdue. To tell the truth, the rest of the day dragged through a weary length. At the dinner table, her father leaned to her and talked in his usual murmuring voice, which could reach her own ear and no other by any chance. "Nelly, there's going to be the devil to pay around the corner. You know why? Now, be a good girl and a wise girl and play your cards. Donnegan is losing his head. He's losing it over you. So play your cards." "Turn down Nick and take up with Donnegan?" she asked coldly. "I've said enough already," said her father, and would not speak again. But it was easy to see that he already felt Lord Nick's star to be past its full glory. Afterward, Lebrun himself took his daughter over to Milligan's and left her under the care of the dance hall proprietor. "I'm waiting for someone," said Nelly, and Milligan sat willingly at her table and made talk. He was like the rest of the corner, full of the subject of the strange encounter between Lord Nick and Donnegan. What had Donnegan done to the big man? Nelly merely smiled and said they would all know in time. One thing was certain, Lord Nick had not taken water. But at this Milligan smiled behind his hand. 10 minutes later there was that stir which announced the arrival of some public figures, and Donnegan, with Big George behind him, came into the room. This evening he went straight to the table to Nelly Lebrun. Milligan, a little uneasy, rose, but Donnegan was gravely polite and regretted that he had interrupted. "I have only come to ask you for 5 minutes of your time," he said to the girl. She was about to put him off merely to make sure of her hold over him, but something she saw in his face fascinated her. She could not play her game. Milligan had slipped away before she knew it, and Donnegan was in his place at the table. He was as much changed as Lord Nick, she thought. Not that his clothes were less carefully arranged than ever, but in the compression of his lips and something behind his eyes she felt the difference. She would have given a great deal indeed to have learned what went on behind the door of Donnegan's shack when Lord Nick was there. "Last time you asked for 1 minute and stayed half an hour," she said. "This time it's 5 minutes." No matter what was on his mind, he was able to answer fully as lightly. "When I talk about myself, I'm always long-winded." "Tonight it's someone else?" "Yes." She was, being a woman, intensely disappointed, but her smile was as bright as ever. "Of course I'm listening." "You remember what I told you of Landis and the girl on the hill? She seems to stick in your thoughts, Mr. Donnegan." "Yes, she's a lovely child." And by his frankness he very cunningly disarmed her. Even if he had hesitated an instant, she would have been on the track of the truth. But he had foreseen the question, and his reply came back instantly. He added, "Also, what I say has to do with Lord Nick." "Ah," said the girl a little coldly. Donnegan went on. He had chosen frankness to be his role, and he played it to the full. "It's a rather wonderful story," he went on. "You know that Lord Nick went up the hill for Landis, and the Corner was standing around waiting for him to bring the youngster down?" "Of course." "There was only one obstacle, which you had so kindly removed myself." "For your own sake, Mr. Donnegan." "Ah, don't you suppose that I know?" And his voice touched her. "He came to kill me, and no doubt he could have done so." Such frankness shocked her into a new attention. Perhaps Donnegan overdid his part a little at this point, for in her heart of hearts she knew that the little man would 1,000 times rather die than give way to any living man. "But I threw my case boldly before him, the girl, her love for Landis, and the fear which revolved around your own unruly eyes, you know, if he were sent back to your father's house. I placed it all before him. At first he was for fighting at once. But the story appealed to him. He pitied the girl, and in the end he decided to let the matter be judged by a third person. He suggested a man. But I know that a man would see in my attitude nothing but foolishness. No man could have appreciated the position of that girl on the hill. I myself named another referee. Yourself." She gasped. "And so I have come to place the question before you, because I know that you will decide honestly." "Then I shall be honest," said the girl. She was thinking, why not have Landis back? It would keep the 3 men revolving around her. Landis on his feet and well would have been nothing. Either of these men would have killed him. But Landis sick, she might balance in turn against them both. Nelly had the instincts of a fencer. She loved balance. But Donnegan was heaping up his effects, for by the shadow in her eyes he well knew what was passing through her mind, and he dared not let her speak too quickly. "There is more hanging upon it. In the first place, if Landis is left with the girl, it gives the colonel a chance to work on him, and like as not the colonel will get the young fool to sign away the mines to him. Frighten him, you see, though I've made sure that the colonel will not actually harm him." "How have you made sure? They say the colonel is a devil." "I have spoken with him. The colonel is not altogether without sensibility to fear." She caught the glint in the little man's eye, and she believed. "So much for that. Landis is safe, but his money may not be. Another thing still hangs upon your decision. Lord Nick wanted to know why I trusted to you. Because I felt you were honest. Why did I feel that? There was nothing to do. Besides, how could I conceal myself from such a man? I spoke frankly and told him that I trusted you because I love you." She closed her hand hard on the edge of the table to steady herself. "And he made no move at you?" He restrained himself. "Lord Nick?" gasped the incredulous girl. "He is a gentleman," said Donnegan, with a singular pride which she could not understand. He went on, "And unfortunately I fear that if you decide in favor of my side of the argument, I feel that Lord Nick will feel that you " He was apparently unable to complete his sentence. "He will feel that you no longer care for him," said Donnegan at length. The girl pondered him with cloudy eyes. "What is behind all this frankness?" she asked coldly. "I shall tell you. Hopelessness is behind it. Last night I poured my heart at your feet, and I had hope. Today I have seen Lord Nick, and I no longer hope. Ah, he is worthy of a lovely woman's affection, and I " He called her attention to himself with a deprecatory gesture. "Do you ask me to hurt him like this?" said the girl. "His pride is the pride of the fiend. Love me, he would hate me." "It might be true. Still I know you would risk it because " He paused. "Well?" asked the girl, whispering in her excitement. "Because you are a lady." He bowed to her. "Because you are fair, because you are honest, Nelly Lebrun. Personally, I think that you can win Lord Nick back with 1 minute of smiling. But you might not. You might alienate him forever. It will be clumsy to explain to him that you were influenced not by me, but by justice. He will make it a personal matter, whereas you and I know that it is only the right that you are seeing." She propped her chin on the tips of her fingers, and her arms were a thing of grace. For the last moments that clouded expression had not cleared. "If only I could read your mind," she murmured now. "There is something behind it all. I shall tell you what it is. It's the restraint that has fallen upon me. It is because I wish to lean closer to you across the table and speak to you of things which are at the other end of the world from Landis and the other girl. It is because I have to keep my hands gripped hard to control myself. Because, though I have given up hope, I would follow a forlorn chance, a lost cause, and tell you again and again that I love you, Nelly Lebrun." He had half lowered his eyes as he spoke. He had called up a vision, and the face of Lou Macon hovered dimly between him and Nelly Lebrun. If all that he spoke was a lie, let him be forgiven for it. It was the golden-haired girl whom he addressed, and it was she who gave the tremor and fiber to his voice. After all, was he not pleading for her happiness as he believed? He covered his eyes with his hand, but when he looked up again she could see the shadow of the pain which was slowly passing. She had never seen such emotion in a man's face, and it was for another. How could she guess it? Her blood was singing in her veins, and the old question was flying back and forth through her brain like a shuttle through a loom. Which shall it be? She called up the picture of Lord Nick, half broken but still terrible. She well knew. She pitied him, but when did pity wholly rule the heart of a woman? As for Nelly Lebrun, she had the ambition of a young Caesar. She could not fill a second place. He who loved her must stand first, and she saw Donnegan as the invincible man. She had not believed half of his explanation. No, he was shielding Lord Nick. Behind that shield the truth was that the big man had quailed before the small. Of course she saw that Donnegan, pretending to be constrained by his agreement with Lord Nick, was in reality cunningly pleading his own cause. But his passion excused him. When has a woman condemned a man for loving her beyond the rules of fair play? "Whatever you may decide," Donnegan was saying, "I shall be prepared to stand by it without a murmur. Send Landis back to your father's house, and I submit. I leave The Corner and say farewell. But now think quickly, for Lord Nick is coming to receive your answer." End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. If the meeting between Lord Nick and Donnegan earlier that day had wrought up the nerves of The Corner to the point of hysteria, if the singular end of that meeting had plied mystery upon excitement, if the appearance of Donnegan sitting calmly at the table of the girl who was known to be engaged to Nick had further stimulated public curiosity, the appearance of Lord Nick was now a crowning burden under which The Corner staggered. Yet not a man or woman stirred from his chair, for everyone knew that if the long-delayed battle between these two gunfighters was at length to take place, neither bullet was apt to fly astray. But what happened completed the wreck of The Corner's nerve, for Lord Nick walked quietly across the floor and sat down with Nelly Lebrun and his somber rival. Oddly enough, he looked at Donnegan, not at the girl, and this token of the beaten man decided her. "Well?" said Lord Nick. "I have decided," said the girl. "Landis should stay where he is." Neither of the two men stirred hand or eye, but Lord Nick turned gray. At length he rose and asked Donnegan quietly to step aside with him. Seeing them together, the difference between their sizes was more apparent. Donnegan seemed hardly larger than a child beside the splendid bulk of Lord Nick, but she could not overhear their talk. "You've won," said Lord Nick. "Both Landis and Nelly and—" "Wait," broke in Donnegan eagerly. "Henry, I've persuaded Nelly to see my side of the case, but that doesn't mean that she has turned from you to—" "Stop," put in Lord Nick between his teeth. "I've not come to argue with you or ask advice or opinions. I've come to state facts. You've crawled in between me and Nelly like a snake in the grass. Very well. You're my brother. That keeps me from handling you. You've broken my reputation, just as I said you would do. The bouncer at the door looked me in the eye and smiled when I came in." He had to pause a little, breathing heavily and avoiding Donnegan's eyes. Finally he was able to continue. "I'm going to roll my blankets and leave The Corner and everything I have in it. You'll get my share of most things, it seems." He smiled after a ghastly, mirthless fashion. "I give you a free road. I surrender everything to you, Donnegan. But there are two things I want to warn you about. It may be that my men will not agree with me. It may be that they'll want to put up a fight for the mine. They can't get at it without getting at Macon. They can't get at him without removing you, and they'll probably try it. I warn you now. Another thing, from this moment there's no blood ties between us. I've found a brother and lost him in the same day. And if I ever cross you again, Donnegan, I'll shoot you on sight. Remember, I'm not threatening. I simply warn you in advance. If I were you, I'd get out of the country. Avoid me, Donnegan, as you'd avoid the devil." And he turned on his heel. He felt the eyes of the people in the room follow him by jerks, dwelling on every one of his steps. Near the door, stepping aside to avoid a group of people coming in, he half turned, and he could not avoid the sight of Donnegan and Nelly Lebrun at the other end of the room. He was leaning across the table, talking with a smile on his lips. At that distance he could not mark the pallor of the little man's face, and Nelly Lebrun was laughing, laughing already, and oblivious of the rest of the world. Lord Nick turned, a blur coming before his eyes, and made blindly for the door. A body collided with him. Without a word he drew back his massive right fist and knocked the man down. The stunned body struck against the wall and collapsed along the floor. Lord Nick felt a great madness swell in his heart. Yet he set his teeth, controlled himself, and went on toward the house of Lebrun. He had come within an eyelash of running amuck, and the quivering hunger for action was still swelling and ebbing in him when he reached the gambler's house. Lebrun was not in the gaming house, no doubt, at this time of night, but the rest of Nick's chosen men were there. They stood up as he entered the room. Henry Masters, newly arrived, the peddler Joe Rix, three names famous in the mountain desert for deeds which were not altogether a pleasant aroma in the nostrils of the law-abiding, but whose sins had been deftly covered from legal proof by the cunning of Nick, and whose bravery itself had half redeemed them. They rose as three wolves rise at the coming of the leader, but this time there was a question behind their eyes, and he read it in gloomy silence. "Well?" asked Henry Masters. In the old days not one of them would have dared to voice the question, but now things were changing, and well, Lord Nick could read the change and its causes. "Are you talking to me?" asked Nick, and he looked straight between the eyes of Masters. The glance of the others did not falter, and it maddened Nick. "I'm talking to you," said Masters coldly enough. "What happened between you and Donnegan?" "What should happen?" asked Lord Nick. "Maybe all this is a joke," said Masters bitterly. He was a square-built man with a square face and a wrinkled, fleshy forehead. In intelligence, Nick ranked him first among the men, and if a new leader were to be chosen, there was no doubt as to where the choice of the men would fall. No doubt that was why Masters put himself forward now, ready to brave the wrath of the chief. "Maybe we're fooled," went on Masters. "Maybe there ain't any call for you to fall out with Donnegan." "Maybe there's a call to find out this," answered Lord Nick. "Why did you leave the mines? What are you doing here?" The other swallowed so hard that he blinked. "I left the mines," he declared through his set teeth, "because I was run off of 'em." "Ah," said Lord Nick, for the devil was rising in him. "I always had an idea that you might be yellow, Masters." The right hand of Masters swayed toward his gun, hesitated, and then poised idly. "You heard me talk?" persisted Lord Nick brutally. "I called you yellow. Why don't you draw on me? I called you yellow, you swine, and I call the rest of you yellow. You think you have me down? Why, curse you, if there were 30 of your cut, I'd say the same to you." There was a quick shift. The three men faced Lord Nick, but each from a different angle, and opposing them he stood superbly indifferent, his arms folded, his feet braced. His arms were folded, but each hand, for all they knew, might be grasping the butt of a gun hidden away in his clothes. Once they flashed a glance from face to face, but there was no action. They were remembering only too well some of the wild deeds of this giant. "You think I'm through?" went on Lord Nick. "Maybe I am. Through with you. You hear me talk?" One by one his eyes dared them, and one by one they took up the challenge, struggled, and lowered their glances. He was still their master, and in that mute moment the three admitted it, the peddler last of all. Masters saw fit to fall back on the last remark. "I've swallowed a lot from you, Nick," he said gravely. "Maybe there'll be an end to what we take on these days, but now I'll tell you how yellow I was. A couple of gents come to me and tell me I'm through at the mine. I told them they were crazy. They said old Colonel Macon had sent them down to take charge. I laughed at 'em. They went away and came back. Who with? With the sheriff, and he flashed a paper on me. It was all drawn up clean as a whistle, trimmed up with a lot of whereases and hereinbefore mentioned, and such like things. But the sheriff just give me a look, and then he tells me what it's all about. Jack Landis has signed over all the mines to the colonel, and the colonel has taken possession." As he stopped, a growl came from the others. "Lester is the man that has the complaint," said Lord Nick. "Where do the rest of you figure in? Lester had the mines. He lost 'em because he couldn't drop Landis with his gun. He'd never have had a smell of gold if I hadn't come in. Who made Landis see light? I did. Who worked it so that every nickel that came out of the mines went through the fingers of Landis and came back to us? I did. But I'm through with you. You can hunt for yourselves now. I've kept you together to guard one another's backs. I've kept the law off your trail. You, Masters, you'd have swung for killing the McKay brothers. Who saved you? Who was it bribed that jury that tried you for shooting up of Derbyville? Peddler? Who took the marshal off your trail after you knifed Lefty Waller? Joe Rix? I've saved you all 12 times. Now you whine at me. I'm through with you forever." Stopping, he glared about him. His knuckles stung from the impact of the blow he had delivered in Milligan's place. He hungered to have one of these three stir a hand and get into action. And they knew it. All at once they crumbled and became clay in his hands. "Chief," said Joe Rix, the smoothest spoken of the lot, and one who was supposed to stand especially well with Lord Nick on account of his ability to bake beans, Spanish. "Chief, you've said a whole pile. You're worth more than the rest of us all rolled together. Sure, we know that. There ain't any argument. But here's just one little point that I want to make. We was doing fine. The gold was running fine and free. Along comes this Donnegan. He busts up our good time. He forks in on your girl." Convulsion of the chief's face made Rix waver in his speech, and then he went on. "He shoots Landis, and when he misses killing him by some accident, he comes down here and grabs him out of LeBron's own house. Smooth, huh? Then he makes Landis sign that deed to the mines. Oh, very nice work, I say. Too nice. Now, speaking man to man, there ain't any doubt you'd like to get rid of Donnegan. Why don't you? Because everybody has a jinx, and he's yours. I ain't easy scared, maybe, but I knew an albino with white eyes once, and just to look at him made me some sick. Well, Chief, there ain't anybody can say that you ever took water or ever will, but maybe the fact that this Donnegan has hair just as plumb red as yours may sort of get you off your feed. I'm just suggesting. Now, what I say is, let the rest of us take a crack at Donnegan, and you sit back and come in on the results when we've cleaned up. Do you give us a free road?" How much went through the brain of Lord Nick? But in the end he gave his brother up to death, for he remembered how Nelly Lebrun had sat in Milligan's laughing. "Do what you want," he said suddenly, "but I want to know none of your plans, and the man that tells me Donnegan is dead gets paid in lead." End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The smile of Joe Rix was the smile of a diplomat. It could be maintained upon his face as unwaveringly as if it were wrought out of marble while Joe heard insult and lie. As a matter of fact, Joe had smiled in the face of death more than once, and this is a school through which even diplomats rarely pass. Yet it was with an effort that he maintained the characteristic good-natured expression when the door to Donnegan's shack opened and he saw Big George, and, beyond him, Donnegan himself. "Booze," said Joe Rix to himself instantly, for Donnegan was a wreck. The unshaven beard, it was the middle of the morning, was a reddish mist over his face. His eyes were sunken in shadow. His hair was uncombed. He sat with his shoulders hunched up like one who suffers from cold. Altogether, his appearance was that of one whose energy had been utterly sapped. "The top of the morning, Mr. Donnegan," said Joe Rix, and put his foot on the threshold. But since Big George did not move, it was impossible to enter. "Who's there?" asked Donnegan. It was a strange question to ask, for by raising his eyes he could have seen, but Donnegan was staring down at the floor. Even his voice was a weak murmur. What a party he's had, thought Joe Rix. And after all, there was cause for a celebration. Had not the little man, in almost one stroke, won the heart of the prettiest girl in the corner, and also, did he not probably have a working share in the richest of the diggings? "I'm Joe Rix," he said. "Joe Rix?" murmured Donnegan softly. "Then you're one of Lord Nick's men." "I was," said Joe Rix, Sort of attached to him, maybe." Perhaps this pointed remark won the interest of Donnegan. He raised his eyes, and Joe Rix beheld the most unhappy face he had ever seen. A bad hangover, he decided, and that makes it bad for me. "Come in," said Donnegan, in the same monotonous, lifeless voice. Big George, reluctantly it seemed, withdrew to one side, and Rix was instantly in the room and drawing out a chair so that he could face Donnegan. "I was," he proceeded, "sort of tied up with Lord Nick, but," and here he winked broadly, "it ain't much of a secret that Nick ain't altogether a lord any more. Nope. Seems he's turned out sort of common, they say." "What fool," murmured Donnegan, "has told you that? What ass has told you that Lord Nick is a common sort?" It shocked Joe Rix, but being a diplomat, he avoided friction by changing his tactics. "Between you and me," he said calmly enough, "I took what I heard with a grain of salt. There's something about Nick that ain't common, no matter what they say. Besides, they's some men that nobody but a fool would stand up to. It ain't hardly a shame for a man to back down from them." He pointed this remark with a nod to Donnegan. "I'll give you a bit of free information," said the little man, with his weary eyes lighted a little. "There's no man on the face of the earth who could make Lord Nick back down." Once more Joe Rix was shocked to the verge of gaping. He exercised a power of marvelous self-control. "About that," he remarked as pointedly as before, "I got my doubts. Because there's some things that any gent with sense will always clear away from. Maybe not one man, but say a bunch, all standing together." Donnegan leaned back in his chair and waited. Both of his hands remained drooping from the edge of the table, and the tired eyes drifted slowly across the face of Joe Rix. It was obviously not the after effects of liquor. The astonishing possibility occurred to Joe Rix that this seemed to be a man with a broken spirit and a great sorrow. He blinked that absurdity away. "Coming to cases," he went on, "there's yourself, Mr. Donnegan. Now, you're the sort of man that doesn't sidestep nobody. Too proud to do it. But even you, I guess, would step carefully if there was a whole bunch agin you." "No doubt," remarked Donnegan. "I don't mean any ordinary bunch," explained Joe Rix, "but a lot of hard fellows, gents that handle their guns like they was born with a holster on the hip." "Fellows like Nick's crowd?" suggested Donnegan quietly. At this thrust the eyes of Joe narrowed a little. "Yes," he admitted. "I see you get my drift." "I think so." "Two hard fighters would give the best man that ever pulled a gun a lot of trouble, eh?" "No doubt." "And three men? There ain't any question Mr. Donnegan would get him ready for a hole in the ground." "I suppose so." "And four men would make it no fight, just plain butchery." "Yes." "Now, I don't mean that Nick's crowd has any hard feelings about you, Mr. Donnegan." "I'm glad to hear that." "I knew you'd be. That's why I've come all friendly to talk things over. Suppose you look at it this way." "Joe Rix," broke in Donnegan, sighing, "I'm very tired. Won't you cut this short? Tell me in 10 words just how you stand." Joe Rix blinked once more, caught his breath, and fired his volley. "Short talk is straight talk, mostly," he declared. "This is what Lester and the rest of us want the mines." "Aye." "Macon stole 'em. We got 'em back through Landis. Now we've got to get 'em back through the colonel himself. But we can't get at the colonel while you're around." "In short, you're going to start out to get me. I expected it, but it's kind of you to warn me." Wait. Don't rush along to conclusions. We ain't so much in a hurry. We don't want you out of the way. We just want you on our side." "Shoot me up and then bring me back to life, eh?" "Mr. Donnegan," said the other, spreading out his hands solemnly on the table, "you ain't doing us justice. We don't hanker none for trouble with you. Any way it comes, a fight with you means somebody dead besides you. We'd get you. 4 to 1 is too much for any man, but one or two of us might go down. Who would it be? Maybe the peddler, maybe Harry Masters, maybe Lester, or maybe me. Oh, we know all that. No gunplay if we can keep away from it." "You've left out the name of Lord Nick," said Donnegan. Joe Rix winked. "Seems like you've tended to him once and for all when you got him alone in this cabin. Must have thrown a mighty big scare into him. He won't lift a hand against you now." "No?" murmured Donnegan hoarsely. "Not him. But that leaves 4 of us, and 4 is plenty, eh?" "Perhaps. But I'm not here to insist on that point. No, we put a value on keeping up good feelings between us and you, Mr. Donnegan. We ain't fools. We know a man when we see him, and the fastest gunman that ever slid a gun out of leather ain't the sort of man that me and the rest of the boys pass over lightly. Not us. We know you, Mr. Donnegan. We respect you. We want you with us. We're going to have you with us." "You flatter me, and I thank you. But I'm glad to see that you are at last coming to the point." "I am. And the point is $5,000 that's tied behind the horse that stands outside your door." He pushed his fat hand a little way across the table, as though the gold, even then, were resting in it. A yellow tide of fortune. "For which," said Donnegan, "I'm to step aside and let you at the colonel?" "Right." Donnegan smiled. "Wait," said Joe Rix. "I was making a first offer to see how you stood, but you're right. 5,000 ain't enough, and we ain't cheapskates. Not us, Mr. Donnegan. There's 10,000 cold iron men behind that saddle out there, and every cent of it belongs to you when you come over to our side." But Donnegan merely dropped his chin upon his hand and smiled mirthlessly at Joe Rix. A wild thought came to the other man. Both of Donnegan's hands were far from his weapons. Why not a quick draw, a snapshot, and then the glory of having killed this manslayer in single battle for Joe Rix? The thought rushed red across his brain and then faded slowly. Something kept him back. Perhaps it was the singular calm of Donnegan. No matter how quiet he sat, he suggested the sleeping cat which can leap out of a dead sleep into fighting action at a touch. By the time a second thought had come to Joe Rix, the idea of an attack was like an idea of suicide. "Is that final?" he asked, though Donnegan had not said a word. "It is." Joe Rix stood up. "You put it to us kind of hard, but we want you, Mr. Donnegan. And here's the whole thing in a nutshell. Come over to us. We'll stand behind you. Lord Nick is slipping. We'll put you in his place. You won't even have to face him. We'll get rid of him." "You'll kill him and give his place to me?" asked Donnegan. "We will. And when you're with us, you cut in on the whole amount of coin the mines turn out, and it'll be something tidy. And right now, to show where we stand and how high we put you, I'll let you in on the rock bottom truth, Mr. Donnegan. Out there tied behind my saddle, there's $30,000 in pure gold. You can take it in here and weigh it out." He stepped back to watch this blow take effect. To his unutterable astonishment, the little man had not moved. His chin still rested upon the back of his hand, and the smile which was on the lips and not in the eyes of Donnegan remained there, fixed. "Donnegan," muttered Joe Rix, "if we can't get you, we'll get rid of you. You understand?" But the other continued to smile. It gave Joe Rix a shuddering feeling that someone was stealing behind him to block his way to the door. He cast one swift glance over his shoulder, and then, seeing that the way was clear, he slunk back, always keeping his face to the red-headed man. But when he came to the doorway, his nerve collapsed. He whirled, covered the rest of the distance with a leap, and emerged from the cabin in a fashion ludicrously like one who had been kicked through a door. His nerve returned as soon as the sunlight fell warmly upon him again, and he looked around hastily to see if anyone had observed his flight. There was no one on the whole hillside except Colonel Macon in the invalid chair. and the colonel was smiling broadly, beneficently. He had his perfect hands folded across his breast, and seemed to cast a prayer of peace and goodwill upon Joe Rix. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nelly Lebrun smelled danger. She sensed it as plainly as the deer when the puma comes between her and the wind. The many tokens that something was wrong came to her by small hints which had to be put together before they assumed any importance. First of all, her father, who should have burst out at her in a tirade for having left Lord Nick for Donnegan, said nothing at all, but kept a dark smile on his face when she was near him. He even insinuated that Nick's time was done and that another was due to supersede him. In the second place, she had passed into a room where Masters, Joe Rix, and the Pedlar sat cheek by jowl in close conference with a hum of deep voice, but at her appearance all talk was broken off. It was not strange that they should not invite her into their confidence if they had some dark work ahead of them, but it was exceedingly suspicious that Joe Rix attempted to pass off their whispers by immediately breaking off the soft talk and springing into the midst of a full-fledged jest. Also, it was strangest of all that when the jest ended, even the Pedlar, who rarely smiled, now laughed uproariously and smote Joe soundingly on the back. Even a child could have strung these incidents into a chain of evidence which pointed toward danger. Obviously, the danger was not directly hers, but then it must be directed at someone near to her. Her father? No. He was more apt to be the mainspring of their action. Lord Nick? There was nothing to gain by attacking him. Who was left? Donnegan? As the realization came upon her, it took her breath away for a moment. Donnegan was the man. At breakfast, everyone had been talking about him. Lebrun had remarked that he had a face for the cards, emotionless. Joe Rix had commented upon his speed of hand, and the Pedlar had complimented the little man on his dress. But at lunch not a word was spoken about Donnegan, even after she had dexterously introduced the subject twice. Why the sudden silence? Between morning and noon, Donnegan must have grievously offended them. Fear for his sake stimulated her, but above and beyond this, indeed, there was a mighty feminine curiosity. She smelled the secret. It reeked through the house, and she was devoured by eagerness to know. She handpicked Lord Nick's gang in the hope of finding a weakness among them, some weakness upon which she could play in one of them and draw out what they were all concealing. The Pedlar was as unapproachable as a crag on a mountaintop. Masters was wise as an outlaw bronco. Lester was probably not even in the confidence of the others, because since the affair with Landis his nerve had been shattered to bits, and the others secretly despised him for being beaten by the youngster at the draw. There remained, therefore, only Joe Rix. But Joe Rix was a fox of the first quality. He lied with the smoothness of silk. He could show a dozen colors in as many moments. Come to the windward of Joe Rix? It was a delicate business, but since there was nothing else to do, she fixed her mind upon it, working out this puzzle. Joe Rix wished to destroy Donnegan for reasons that were evidently connected with the mines, and she must step into his confidence to discover his plans. How should it be done? And there was a vital need for speed, for they might be within a step of executing whatever mischief it was that they were planning. She went down from her room. They were still there, only Joe Rix was not with them. She went to the apartment where he and the other three of Nick's gang slept, and rapped at the door. He maintained the smile when he saw her, but there was an uncertain quiver of his eyebrows that told her much. Plainly he was ill at ease. Suspicious? Aye. There were always clouds of suspicion drifting over the red, round face of Joe Rix. She put a tremor of excitement and trouble in her voice. "Come into my room, Joe, where we won't be interrupted." He followed her without a word, and since she led the way, she was able to relax her expression for a necessary moment. When she closed the door behind him and faced Joe again, she was once more ready to step into her part. She did not ask him to sit down. She remained for a moment with her hand on the knob and searched the face of Joe Rix eagerly. "Do you think he can hear?" she whispered, gesturing over her shoulder. "Who?" "Who but Lord Nick?" she exclaimed softly. The bewilderment of Joe clouded his face a second, and then he was able to smooth it away. What on earth was the reason for her concern about Lord Nick? He was obviously wondering. "I'll tell you why," she said, answering the unspoken question at once. "He's as jealous as the devil, Joe." The fat little man sighed as he looked at her. "He can't hear, not through that log wall, but we'll talk soft if you want." "Yes, yes, keep your voice down. He's already jealous of you, Joe." "Of me? He knows I like you, that I trust you, and just now he's on edge about everyone I look at." The surprising news which the first part of this sentence contained caused Joe to gape, and the girl looked away in concern, enabling him to control his expression. For she knew well enough that men hate to appear foolishly surprised, and particularly a fox like Joe Rix. "But what's the trouble, Nelly?" he added, with a touch of venom. "I thought everything was going smoothly with you, and I thought you weren't worrying much about what Lord Nick had in his mind." She stared at him as though astonished. "Do you think the same just as the rest of them?" she asked sadly. "Do you mean to say that you're fooled just the same as Harry Masters and the Pedlar and the rest of those fools, including Nick himself?" Joe Rix was by no means willing to declare himself a fool beforehand. He now mustered a look of much reserved wisdom. "I have my own doubts, Nell, but I'm not talking about them." He was so utterly at sea that she had to bite her lip hard to keep from breaking into ringing laughter. "Oh, I knew that you'd see through it, Joe," she cried softly. "You see what an awful mess I've gotten into." He passed a hurried hand across his forehead and then looked at her searchingly. But he could not penetrate her pretense of concern. "No matter what I think," said Joe Rix, "you come out with it frankly. I'll listen." "As a friend, Joe?" She managed to throw a plea into her voice that made Joe sigh. "Sure. You've already said that I'm your friend, and you're right." "I'm in terrible, terrible trouble. You know how it happened. I was a fool. I tried to play with Lord Nick, and now he thinks I was in earnest." As though the strength of his legs had given way, Joe Rix slipped down into a chair. "Go on," he said huskily. "You were playing with Lord Nick?" "Can't you put yourself in my place, Joe? It's always been taken for granted that I'm to marry Nick, and the moment he comes around everybody else avoids me as if I were poison. I was sick of it. And when he showed up this time it was the same old story. A man would as soon sign his own death warrant as ask me for a dance. You know how it is." He nodded, still at sea, but with a light beginning to dawn in his little eyes. "I'm only a girl, Joe. I have all the weakness of other girls. I don't want to be locked up in a cage just because I love one man." The avowal made Joe blink. It was the second time that day that he had been placed in an astonishing scene, but some of his old cunning remained to him. "Nell," he said suddenly, rising from his chair and going to her, "what are you trying to do to me? Pull the wool over my eyes?" It was too much for Nelly Lebrun. She knew that she could not face him without betraying her guilt, and therefore she did not attempt it. She whirled and flung herself on her bed, face down, and began to sob violently, suppressing the sounds, and so she waited. Presently a hand touched her shoulder lightly. "Go away!" cried Nelly in a choked voice. "I hate you, Joe Rix. You're like all the rest." His knee struck the floor with a soft thud. Come on, Nell, don't be hard on me. I thought you were stringing me a little, but if you're playing straight, tell me what you want." At that she bounced upright on the bed, and before he could rise she caught him by both shoulders. "I want Donnegan," she said fiercely. "What?" "I want him dead." Joe Rix gasped. "Here's the cause of all my trouble. Just because I flirted with him once or twice, Nick thought I was in earnest, and now he's sulking, and Donnegan puts on airs and acts as if I belonged to him. I hate him, Joe. And if he's gone, Nick will come back to me. He'll come back to me, Joe, and I want him so." She found that Joe Rix was staring straight into her eyes, striving to probe her soul to its depths, and by a great effort she was enabled to meet that gaze. Finally, the fat little man rose slowly to his feet. Her hands trailed from his shoulders as he stood up and fell helplessly upon her lap. "Well, I'll be hanged, Nell!" exclaimed Joe Rix. "What do you mean?" "You're not acting a part? No, I can see you mean it. But what a cold-blooded little—" He checked himself. His face was suddenly jubilant. "Then we've got him, Nell. We've got him if you're with us. We had him anyway, but we'll make sure of him if you're with us. Look at this. You saw me put a paper in my pocket when I opened the door of my room? Here it is." He displayed before the astonished eyes of Nelly Lebrun a paper covered with an exact duplicate of her own swift, dainty script, and she read: "Nick is terribly angry and is making trouble. I have to get away. It isn't safe for me to stay here. Will you help me? Will you meet me at the shack by Donnell's Ford tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock?" "But I didn't write it," cried Nelly Lebrun, bewildered. "Nelly," Joe Rix chuckled, flushing with pleasure, "you didn't. It was me. I kind of had an idea that you wanted to get rid of this Donnegan, and I was going to do it for you and then surprise you with the good news." "Joe, you forged it." "Don't bother saying pretty things about me and my pen," said Rix modestly. "This is nothing. But if you want to help me, Nelly—" His voice faded partly out of her consciousness as she fought against a tigerish desire to spring at the throat of the little fat man. But gradually it dawned on her that he was asking her to write out that note herself. Why? Because it was possible that Donnegan might have seen her handwriting, and in that case, though the imitation had been good enough to deceive Nelly herself, it probably would not for a moment fool the keen eyes of Donnegan. But if she herself wrote out the note, Donnegan was already as good as dead. "That is," concluded Joe Rix, "if he really loves you, Nell." "The fool!" cried Nelly. "He worships the ground I walk on, Joe, and I hate him for it." Even Joe Rix shivered, for he saw the hate in her eyes and could not dream that he himself was the cause and the object of it. There was a red haze of horror and confusion in front of her eyes, and yet she was able to smile while she copied the note for Joe Rix. "But how are you going to work it?" she asked. "How are you going to kill him, Joe?" "Don't bother your pretty head," said the fat man, smiling. "Just wait till we bring you the good news." "But are you sure?" she asked eagerly. "See what he's done already. He's taken Landis away from us. He's baffled Nick himself, in some manner, and he's gathered the minds away from all of us. He's a devil, Joe, and if you want to get him, you'd better take 10 men for the job." "You hate him, Nell, don't you?" queried Joe Rix, and his voice was both hard and curious. "But how has he harmed you?" "Hasn't he taken Nick away from me? Isn't that enough?" The fat man shivered again. "All right, I'll tell you how it works. Now listen." And he began to check off the details of his plan. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The day passed and the night, but how very slowly for Nelly Lebrun. She went up to her room early, for she could no longer bear the meaning glances which Joe Rix cast at her from time to time. But once in her room, It was still harder to bear the suspense as she waited for the noise to die away in the house. Midnight, and a half hour more went by, and then at last the murmurs and the laughter stopped. She alone was wakeful in Lebrun's, and when that time came she caught a scarf around her hair and her shoulders, made of a flimsy material which would veil her face but through which she could see, and ventured out of her room and down the hall. There was no particular need for such caution, however, it seemed. Nothing stirred, and presently she was outside the house and hurrying behind the houses and up the hill. Still she met nothing. If The Corner lived tonight, its life was confined to Milligan's and the gambling house. She found Donnegan's shack and the one next to it, which the terrible colonel occupied, entirely dark. But only a moment after she tapped at the door it was opened. Donnegan, fully dressed, stood in the entrance, outlined blackly by the light which came faintly from the hooded lantern hanging on the wall. Was he sitting up all night, unable to sleep, because he waited breathlessly for that false tryst on the morrow? A great tenderness came over the heart of Nelly Lebrun. "It is I," she whispered. There was a soft exclamation, then she was drawn into the room. "Is there anyone here?" "Only Big George, but he's in the kitchen, and he won't hear. He never hears anything except what's meant for his ears. Take this chair." He was putting a blanket over the rough wood to make it more comfortable, and she submitted dumbly to his ministrations. It seemed terrible and strange to her that one so gentle should be the object of so much hate, such deadly hate as the members of Nick's gang felt for him. And now that he was sitting before her, she could see that he indeed had been wakeful for a long time. His face was grimly wasted. The lips were compressed as one who has endured long pain, and his eyes gleamed at her out of a profound shadow. He remained in the gloom. The light from the lantern fell brightly upon his hands alone, meager, fleshless hands which seemed to represent hardly more strength than that of a child. Truly this man was all a creature of spirit and nerve. Therein lay his strength, as also his weakness. And again the cherishing instinct grew strong and swept over her. "There is no one near," he said, "except the colonel and his daughter. They are up the hillside somewhere. Did you see them?" "No. What in the world are they out for at this time of night?" "Because the colonel only wakes up when the sun goes down. And now he's out there humming to himself, and never speaking a word to the girl. But they won't be far away. They'll stay close to see that no one comes near the cabin to get at Landis." He added, "They must have seen you come into my cabin." And his lips set even harder than before. Was it fear because of her? "They may have seen me enter, but they won't know who it was. You have the note from me?" "Yes." "It's a lie. It's a ruse. I was forced to write it to save you. For they're planning to murder you. Oh, my dear!" "Hush, hush! Murder?" "I've been nearly hysterical all day and all night. But thank heaven I'm here to warn you in time. You mustn't go. You mustn't go." "Who is it?" He had drawn his chair closer. He had taken her hands, and she noted that his own were icy cold, but steady as a rock. Their pressure soothed her infinitely. "Joe Rix, the peddler, Harry Masters. They'll be at the shack at 10 o'clock, but not I." Murder? But a very clumsy scheme. 3 men leave town and commit a murder and then expect to go undetected, not even in the mountain desert. "But you don't understand. You don't understand. They're wise as foxes. They'll take no risk. They don't even leave town together or travel by the same routes. Harry Masters starts first. He rides out at 8 o'clock in the morning and takes the north trail. He rides down the gulch and winds out of it and strikes for the shack at the ford. At 8:30 the peddler starts. He goes past Sandy's place and then over the trail through the marsh. You know it?" "Yes." "Last of all, Joe Rix starts at 9 o'clock. Half an hour between them. How does he go to the shack? By the south trail. He takes the ridge of the hills. But they'll all be at the shack long before you, and they'll shoot you down from a distance as you come up to it. Plain murder. But even for cowardly murder they daren't face you except 3-1. He was thoughtful. Suppose they were to be met on the way. You're mad to think of it. But if they fail this time they'll try again. They must be taught a lesson. 3 men, oh my dear, promise. Very well. I shall do nothing rash, and I shall never forget that you've come to tell me this and been in peril, Nell, for if they found you had come to me, the peddler would cut my throat. I know him. Ah, but now you must go. I'll take you down the hill, dear. No, no. It's much easier to get back alone. My face will be covered. But there's no way you could be disguised. You have a way of walking. Good night, and God bless you. She was in his arms, straining him to her, and then she slipped out the door. And sure enough, there was the colonel in his chair, not 50 feet away, with a girl pushing him. The moonlight was too dim for Nelly Lebrun to make out the face of Lou Macon, but even the light which escaped through the filter of clouds was enough to set her golden hair glowing. The color was not apparent, but its luster was soft silver in the night. There was a murmur of the colonel's voice as Nelly came out of the cabin, and then from the girl a low cry. It brought the blood to the cheeks of Nelly as she hurried down the hill, for she recognized the pain that was in it, and it occurred to her that if the girl was in love with Jack Landis, she was strangely interested in Donnegan also. The thought came so sharply home to her that she paused abruptly on the way down the hill. After all, this Macon girl would be a very strange sort if she were not impressed by the little red-headed man with his gentle voice and his fiery ways, and his easy way of making himself a brilliant spectacle whenever he appeared in public. And Nelly remembered also, with a keen suspicion of a woman in love, how weakly Donnegan had responded to her embrace this night, how absent-mindedly his arms had held her, and how numbly they had fallen away when she turned at the door. But she shook her head and made the suspicion shudder its way out of her. Lou Macon, she decided, was just the sort of girl who would think Jack Landis an ideal. Besides, she had never had an opportunity to see Donnegan in his full glory at Milligan's. And as for Donnegan, he was wearied out, his nerves relaxed, and for the deeds with which he had startled The Corner and won her own heart, he was now paying the penalty in the shape of ruined nerves. Pity again swelled in her heart, and a consuming hatred for the 3 murderers who lived in her father's house. And when she reached her room again, her heart was filled with a singing happiness and a glorious knowledge that she had saved the man she loved. And Donnegan himself? He had seen Lou and her father. He had heard that low cry of pain, and now he sat bowed again over his table, his face in his hands, and a raging devil in his heart. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was one complication which Nelly Lebrun might have foreseen after her pretended change of heart and her simulated confession to Joe Rix that she still loved the lion-like Lord Nick. But strangely enough, she did not think of this phase, and even when her father the next morning approached her in the hall and tapping her arm whispered, "Good girl, Nick has just heard and he's hunting for you now," even then the full meaning did not come home to her. It was not until she saw the great form of Lord Nick stalking swiftly down the hall that she knew. He came with a glory in his face which the last day had graven with unfamiliar lines, and when he saw her he threw up his hand so that it almost brushed the ceiling, and cried out. What could she do? Try to push him away, to explain? There was nothing to be done. She had to submit when he swept her into his arms. "Rix has told me. Rix has told me. Ah, Nell, you little fox." "Told you what, Nick?" Was he, too, a party to the murderous plan? But he allowed himself to be pushed away. "I've gone through something in the last few days. Why did you do it, girl?" She saw suddenly that she must continue to play her part. "Some day I'll tell you why it was that I gave you up so easily, Nell. You thought I was afraid of Donnegan?" He ground his teeth and turned pale at the thought. "But that wasn't it. Some day I can tell you. But after this, the first man who comes between us, Donnegan or any other, I'll turn him into powder under my heel." He ground it into the floor as he spoke. She decided that she would see how much he knew. "It will never be Donnegan, at least," she said. "He's done for today. And I'm almost sorry for him, in spite of all that he's done." He became suddenly grave. "What are you saying, Nell?" "Why, Joe told you, didn't he? They've drawn Donnegan out of town, and now they're lying in wait for him. Yes, they must have him by this time. It's 10 o'clock." A strange, tense exclamation broke from Lord Nick. "They've gone for Donnegan?" "Yes. Are you angry?" The big man staggered. One would have said that he had been stunned with a blow. "Garry," he whispered. "What are you saying?" "Nell," he muttered hoarsely. "Did you know about it?" "But I did it for you, Nick. I knew you hated." "No, no, don't say it," he added bitterly after a moment. "This is for my sins." And then to her, "But you knew about it and didn't warn him. You hated him all the time you were laughing with him and smiling at him. Oh, Nell, what a merciless witch of a woman you are! For the rest of them, I'll wait till they come back." "What are you going to do, Nick?" "I told them I'd pay the man who killed Donnegan with lead. Did the fools think I didn't mean it?" Truly, no matter what shadow had passed over the big man, he was the lion again, and Nell shrank from him. "We'll wait for them," he said. "We'll wait for them here." And they sat down together in the room. She attempted to speak once in a shaken voice, but he silenced her with a gesture, and after that she sat and watched in quiet the singular play of varying expressions across his face. Grief, rage, tenderness, murderous hate. They followed like a puppet play. What was Donnegan to him? And then there was a tremor of fear. Would the three suspect when they reached the shack by the ford and no Donnegan came to them? The moments stole on. Then the soft beat of a galloping horse in the sand. The horse stopped. Presently they saw Joe Rix and Harry Masters pass in front of the window, and they looked as though a cyclone had caught them up, juggled them a dizzy distance in the air, and then flung them down carelessly upon bruising rocks. Their hats were gone, and the clothes of burly Harry Masters were literally torn from his back. Joe Rix was evidently far more terribly hurt, for he leaned on the arm of Masters, and they came on together, staggering. "They've done the business," exclaimed Lord Nick, "and now, curse them, I'll do theirs." But the girl could not speak. A black haze crossed before her eyes. Had Donnegan gone out madly to fight the three men in spite of her warning? The door opened. They stood in the doorway, and if they had seemed a horrible sight passing the window, they were a deadly picture at close range. And opposite them stood Lord Nick. In spite of their wounds, there was murder in his face, and his revolver was out. "You've met him? You've met Donnegan?" he asked angrily. Masters literally carried Joe Rix to a chair and placed him in it. He had been shot through both shoulders, and though tight bandages had staunched the wound, he was still in agony. Then Masters raised his head. "We've met him," he said. "What happened?" But Masters, in spite of the naked gun in the hand of Lord Nick, was looking straight at Nelly Lebrun. "We fought him." "Then say your prayers, Masters." "Say prayers for the peddler, you fool," said Masters bitterly. "He's dead, and Donnegan's still living." There was a faint cry from Nelly Lebrun. She sank into her chair again. "We've been double-crossed," said Masters, still looking at the girl. "I was going down the gulch the way we planned. I come to the narrow place where the cliffs almost touch, and right off the wall above me drops a wildcat. I thought it was a cat at first, and then I found it was Donnegan. The way he hit me from above knocked me off the horse. Then we hit the ground. I started for my gun. He got it out of my hand. I pulled my knife. He got that away too. His fingers work with steel springs and act like a cat's claws. Then we fought barehanded. He didn't say a word, but kept snarling in his throat, always like a cat. And his face was devilish. Made me sick inside. Pretty soon he dived under my arms, got me up in the air. I came down on my head. Of course, I went out cold. When I came to, there was still a mist in front of my eyes and this lump on the back of my head. He figured that my head was cracked and that I was dead. That's the only reason he left me. Later, I climbed on my horse and fed him the spur. But I was too late. I took the straight cut for the ford, and when I got there, I found that Donnegan had been there before me. Joe Rix was lying on the floor. When he got to the shack, Donnegan was waiting for him. They went for their guns, and Donnegan beat him to it. The hound didn't shoot to kill. He plugged him through both shoulders and left him lying helpless. But I got a couple of bandages on him and saved him. Then we cut back for home and crossed the marsh, and there we found the peddler. Too late to help him. Maybe Donnegan knew that the peddler was something of a flash with a gun himself, and he didn't take any chances. He met him face to face the same way he met Joe Rix and killed him. Shot him clean between the eyes. Think of shooting for the head with a snap shot. That's what he done, and Joe didn't have time to think twice after that slug hit him. His gun wasn't even fired. He was beat so bad on the draw. So Joe and me come back home, and we come full of questions. "Let me tell you something," muttered Lord Nick, putting up the weapon which he had kept exposed during all of the recital. "You got what was coming to you. If Donnegan hadn't cleaned up on you, you'd have had to talk turkey with me, understand?" "Wait a minute," protested Harry Masters. And Joe Rix, almost too far gone for speech, set his teeth over a groan and cast a look of hatred at the girl. "Wait a minute, Chief. There's one thing we all got to get straight. Somebody had tipped off Donnegan about our whole plan. Was it the peddler or Rix or me? I guess good sense to tell a man that it wasn't none of us, eh? Then who was it? The only other person who knew about the plan, Nell. Nell, the crooked witch. And it's her that murdered the peddler. Curse her." He thrust out his bulky arm as he spoke. "Her that lied her way into our confidence with a lot of talk about you, Nick. Then what did she do? She goes running to the gent that she said she hated. Don't you see her play? She makes fools of us. She makes a fool out of you." She dared not meet the glance of Lord Nick. Even now she might have acted out her part and filled in with lies, but she was totally unnerved. "Get Rix to bed," was all he said, and he did not even glance at Nelly Lebrun. Masters glowered at him and then silently obeyed, lifting Joe as a helpless bulk, for the fat man was nearly fainting with pain. Not until they had gone and he had closed the door after them, and upon the murmurs of the servants in the hall, did Lord Nick turn to Nelly. "Is it true?" he asked shortly. Between relief and terror her mind was whirling. "Is what true?" "You haven't even sense enough to lie, Nell, huh? It's all true then. And last night, after you wormed it out of Joe, you went to Donnegan." She could only stare miserably at him. "And that's why you pushed me away when I kissed you a little while ago." Once more she was dumb, but she was beginning to be afraid, not for herself, but for Donnegan. "Nell, I told you I'd never let another man come between us again. I meant it. I know you're treacherous now, but that doesn't keep me from wanting you. It's Donnegan again. Donnegan still. Nell, you've killed him. As sure as if your own finger pulled the trigger when I shoot him. He's a dead one, and you've done it." If only words would come, but her throat was stiff and cold and aching. She could not speak. "You've done more than kill him," said Lord Nick. "You've put a curse on me as well. And afterward I'm going to even up with you. You hear me? Nell, when I shoot Donnegan, I'm doing a thing worse than if he were a girl or a baby. You can't understand that. I don't want you to know. But sometime, when you're happy again and you're through grieving for Donnegan, I'll tell you the truth and make your heart black for the rest of your life." Still words would not come. She strove to cling to him and stop him, but he cast her away with a single gesture and strode out the door. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was no crowd to block the hill at this second meeting of Donnegan and Lord Nick. There was a blank stretch of brown hillside, with the wind whispering stealthily through the dead grass, when Lord Nick thrust open the door of Donnegan's shack and entered. The little man had just finished shaving and was getting back into his coat while George carried out the basin of water, and Donnegan, as he buttoned the coat, was nodding slightly to the rhythm of a song which came from the cabin of the colonel nearby. It was a clear, high music, and though the voice was light, it carried the sound far. Donnegan looked up to Lord Nick, but he still kept the beat of the music. He seemed even more fragile this morning than ever before, yet Lord Nick was fresh from the sight of the torn bodies of the two fighting men whom this fellow had struck and left for dead, or dying, as he thought. "Dismiss your servant," said Lord Nick. "George, you may go out." "And keep him out." "Don't come back until I call for you." Big George disappeared into the kitchen, and the outside door was closed. Yet, even with all the doors closed, the singing of Lou Macon kept running through the cabin in a sweet and continuous thread. "What made the ball so fine, Robin Adair? What made the assembly shine, Robin Adair?" And no matter what Lord Nick could say, it seemed that with half his mind Donnegan was listening to the song of the girl. "First," said the big man, "I've broken my word." Donnegan waved his hand and dismissed the charge. He pointed to a chair, but Lord Nick paid no heed. "I've broken my word," he went on. "I promised that I'd give you a clear road to win over Nelly Lebrun. I gave you the road and you've won her, but now I'm taking her back." "Ah, Henry," said Donnegan, and a flash of eagerness came into his eyes. "You're 1,000 times welcome to her." Lord Nick quivered. "Do you mean it?" "Henry, don't you see that I was only playing for a purpose all the time? And if you've opened the eyes of Nelly to the fact that you truly love her, and I've only been acting out a heartless sham, why, I'm glad of it. I rejoice. Henry, I swear I do." He came forward smiling and held out his hand. Lord Nick struck it down, and Donnegan shrank back, holding his wrist tight in the fingers of his other hand. "Is it possible?" murmured Henry Reardon. "Is it possible that she loves a man who despises her?" "Not that. If any other man said that to me, I'd call for an explanation of his meaning, Henry. No, no. I honor and respect her, I tell you. By heaven, Nick, she has a thread of pure, generous gold in her nature." "Ah?" "She has saved my life no longer ago than this morning." "It's perfect," said Lord Nick, and he writhed under a torment. "I am discarded for the sake of a man who despises her." Donnegan, frowning with thought, watched his older brother, and still the thin singing entered the room, that matchless old melody of Robin Adair. The day shall never come when that song does not go straight from heart to heart. But because Donnegan still listened to it, Lord Nick felt that he was contemptuously received, and a fresh spur was driven into his tender pride. "Donnegan," he said sharply. Donnegan raised his hand slowly. "Do you call me by that name?" "Aye. You've ceased to be a brother. There's no blood tie between us now, as I've warned you before." Donnegan, very white, moved back toward the wall and rested his shoulders lightly against it, as though he needed the support. He made no answer. "I warned you not to cross me again," exclaimed Lord Nick. "I have not." "Donnegan, you've murdered my men." "Murder? I met them fairly, not murder, Henry." "Leave out that name, I say." "If you wish," said Donnegan very faintly. The sight of his resistlessness seemed to madden Lord Nick. He made one of his huge strides and came to the center of the room and dominated all that was in it, including his brother. "You murdered my men," repeated Lord Nick. "You've turned my girl against me with your lying love making and turned her into a spy. You made her set the trap, and then you saw that it was worked. You showed her how she could wind me around her finger again." "Will you let me speak?" "Aye, but be short." "I swear to you, Henry, that I've never influenced her to act against you, except to win her away for just one little time. And she will return to you again. It's only a fancy that makes her interested in me. Look at us. How could any woman in her sense prefer me?" "Are you done?" "No, no, I have more to say. I have 1,000 things." "I shall not hear them." "Henry, there is a black devil in your face. Beware of it." "Who put it there?" "It was not I." "What power, then?" "Something over which I have no control." "Are you trying to mystify me?" "Listen." And as Donnegan raised his hand, the singing poured clear and small into the room. "That is the power," said Donnegan. "You're talking gibberish," exclaimed the other pettishly. "I suppose I shouldn't expect you to understand." "On the other hand, what I have to say is short and to the point. A child could comprehend it. You've stolen the girl. I've tried to let her go. I can't. I have to have her. Willing or unwilling, she has to belong to me, Donnegan." "If you wish, I shall promise that I shall never see her again or speak to her." "You fool! Won't she find you out? Do you think I could trust you? Only in one place underground." Donnegan had clasped his hands upon his breast and his eyes were wide. "What is it you mean, Henry?" "I'll trust you dead." "Henry!" "That name means nothing to me. I've forgotten it. The worlds have forgotten it." "Henry, I implore you to keep cool, to give me 5 minutes to talk." "No, not one. I know your cunning tongue." "For the sake of the days when you loved me, my brother. For the sake of the days when you used to wheel my chair and be kind to me." "You're wasting your time. You're torturing us both for nothing. Donnegan, my will is a rock. It won't change." And drawing closer, his right hand gripped his gun, and the trembling passion of the gunfighter set him shuddering. "You're armed, Garry. Go for your gun." "No, no." "Then I'll give you cause to fight." As he spoke, he drew back his massive arm, and with his open hand smote Donnegan heavily across the face. The weight of that blow crushed the little man against the wall. "Your gun!" cried Lord Nick, swaying from side to side as the passion choked him. Donnegan fell upon his knees and raised his arms. "God have mercy on me and on yourself." At that the blackness cleared slowly on the face of the big man. He thrust his revolver into the holster. "This time," he said, "there's no death. But sooner or later we meet, Donnegan. And then, I swear by all that lives, I'll shoot you down without mercy like a mad dog. You've robbed me. You've hounded me. You've killed my men. And you've taken the heart of the woman I love. And now nothing can save you from the end." He turned on his heel and left the room. And Donnegan remained kneeling, holding a stained handkerchief to his face. All at once his strength seemed to desert him like a tree chopped at the root, and he wilted down against the wall with closed eyes. But the music still came out of the throat and the heart of Lou, and it entered the room and came into the ears of Donnegan. He became aware that there was a strength beyond himself which had sustained him, and then he knew it had been the singing of Lou from the first to the last which kept the murder out of his own heart and restrained the hand of Lord Nick. Perhaps of all Donnegan's life this was the first moment of true humility. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. One thing was now clear. He must not remain in the corner unless he was prepared for Lord Nick again, and in a third meeting guns must be drawn. From that greater sin he shrank and prepared to leave. His order to George made the big man's eyes widen. But George had long since passed the point where he cared to question the decision of his master. He began to build the packs. As for Donnegan, he could see that there was little to be won by remaining. That would save Landis to Lou Macon, to be sure, but after all, he was beginning to wonder if it were not better to let the big fellow go back to his own kind, Lebrun and the rest. For if it needed compulsion to keep him with Lou now, might it not be the same story hereafter? Indeed, Donnegan began to feel that all his labor in the corner had been running on a treadmill. It had all been grouped about the main purpose, which was to keep Landis with the girl. To do that now, he must be prepared to face Nick again, and to face Nick meant the bringing of the guilt of fratricide upon the head of one of them. There only remained flight. He saw at last that he had been fighting blindly from the first. He had won a girl whom he did not love, though doubtless her liking was only the most fickle fancy. And she for whom he would have died he had taught to hate him. It was a grim summing up. Donnegan walked the room whistling softly to himself as he checked up his account. One thing at least he had done. He had taken the joy out of his life forever. And here, answering a rap at the door, he opened it upon Lou Macon. She wore a dress of some very soft material. It was a pale blue, faded, no doubt, but the color blended exquisitely with her hair and with the flush of her face. It came to Donnegan that it was an unnecessary cruelty of chance that made him see the girl lovelier than he had ever seen her before at the very moment when he was surrendering the last shadow of a claim upon her. And it hurt him also to see the freshness of her face, the clear eyes, and to hear her smooth, untroubled voice. She had lived untouched by anything save the sunshine in the corner. Her glance flicked across his face and then fluttered down, and her color increased guiltily. "I have come to ask you a favor," she said. "Step in," said Donnegan, recovering his poise at length. At this she looked past him, and her eyes widened a little. There was an imperceptible shrug of her shoulders, as though the very thought of entering this cabin horrified her, and Donnegan had to bear that look as well. "I'll stay here. I haven't much to say. It's a small thing." "Large or small?" said Donnegan eagerly. "Tell me." "My father has asked me to take a letter for him down to the town and mail it. I understand that it would be dangerous for me to go alone. Will you walk with me?" And Donnegan turned cold. Go down into the corner, where by 5 chances out of 10 he must meet his brother in the street. "I can do better still," he said, smiling. "I'll have George take the letter down for you." "Thank you, but you see, father would not trust it to anyone save me. I asked him. He was very firm about it." "Tush, I would trust George with my life." "Yes, yes. It is not what I wish, but my father rarely changes his mind." Perspiration beaded the forehead of Donnegan. Was there no way to evade this easy request? "You see," he faltered, "I should be glad to go." She raised her eyes slowly. "But I'm terribly busy this morning." She did not answer, but half of her color left her face. "Upon my word of honor, there is no danger to a woman in the town." "But some of the ruffians of Lord Nick?" If they dared to even raise their voices at you, they would hear from him in a manner that they would never forget. Then you don't wish to go?" She was very pale now, and to Donnegan it was more terrible than the gun in the hand of Lord Nick. Even if she thought he was slighting her, why should she take it so mortally to heart? For Donnegan, who saw all things, was blind to read the face of this girl. "It doesn't really matter," she murmured, and turned away. A gentle motion, but it wrenched the heart of Donnegan. He was instantly before her. "Wait here a moment. I'll be ready to go down immediately." "No, I can't take you from your work." What work did she assign to him in her imagination? Endless planning of deviltry, no doubt. "I shall go with you," said Donnegan. "At first I didn't dream it could be so important. Let me get my hat." He left her and leaped back into the cabin. "I'm going down into the corner for a moment," he said over his shoulder to George as he took his belt down from the wall. The big man strolled to the wall and took his hat from a nail. "I shall not need you, George." But George merely grinned, and his big teeth flashed at the master. And in the second place he took up a gun from the drawer and offered it to Donnegan. "The gun in the holster ain't loaded," he said. Donnegan considered him soberly. "I know it. There'll be no need for a loaded gun." But once more George grinned. All at once Donnegan turned pale. "You dog," he whispered. "Did you listen at the door when Nick was here?" "Me?" murmured George. "No. I just been thinking." And so it was that while Donnegan went down the hill with Lou Macon, carrying an empty chambered revolver, George followed at a distance of a few paces, and he carried a loaded weapon, unknown to Donnegan. It was a dull time of the day in The Corner. There were very few people in the single street, and though most of them turned to look at the little man and the girl who walked beside him, not one of them either smiled or whispered. "You see," said Donnegan, "you would have been perfectly safe, even from Lord Nick's ruffians. That was one of his men we passed back there." "Yes, I'm safe with you," said the girl. And when she looked up to him, the blood of Donnegan turned to fire. Out of a shop door before them came a girl with a parcel under her arm. She wore a gay, semi-masculine outfit, bright colored, jaunty, and she walked with a lilt toward them. It was Nelly Lebrun, and as she passed them Donnegan lifted his hat ceremoniously high. She nodded to him with a smile, but the smile aimed wan and small in an instant. There was a quick widening and then a narrowing of her eyes, and Donnegan knew that she had judged Lou Macon as only one girl can judge another who is lovelier. He glanced at Lou to see if she had noticed, but he saw her raise her head and go on, with her glance proudly straight before her. But her face was very pale, and Donnegan knew that she had guessed everything that was true and far more than the truth. Her tone at the door of the post office was ice. "I think you're right, Mr. Donnegan. There's no danger, and if you have anything else to do, I can get back home easily enough." "I'll wait for you," murmured Donnegan sadly, and he stood at the door of the little building with bowed head. And then a murmur came down the street. How small it was, and how sinister! It consisted of exclamations begun, and then broken sharply off. A swirl of people divided as a cloud of dust divides before a blast of wind, and through them came the gigantic figure of Lord Nick. On he came, a gorgeous figure, a veritable king of men. He carried his hat in his hand, and his red hair flamed, and he walked with great strides. Donnegan glanced behind him. The way was clear. If he turned, Lord Nick would not pursue him, he knew. But to flee even from his brother was more than he could do, for the woman he loved would know of it and could never understand. He touched the holster that held his empty gun and waited. An eternity between every step of Lord Nick. Others seemed to have sensed the meaning of this silent scene. People seemed to stand frozen in the midst of gestures. Or was that because Donnegan's own thoughts were traveling at such lightning speed that the rest of the world seemed standing still? What kept Lou Macon? If she were with him, not even Lord Nick in his madness would force on a gunplay in the presence of a woman, no doubt. Lord Nick was suddenly close. He had paused. His voice rang over the street and struck upon Donnegan's ear as sounds come under water. "Donnegan." "Aye," called Donnegan softly. "It's the time." "Aye," said Donnegan. Then a huge body leaped before him. It was Big George, and as he sprang his gun went up with his hand in a line of light. The two reports came close together as finger taps on a table, and Big George, completing his spring, lurched face downward into the sand. Dead? Not yet. All his faith and selflessness were nerving the big man, and Donnegan stood behind him, unarmed. He reared himself upon his knees, an imposing bulk, even then, and fired again. But his hand was trembling, and the bullet shattered a sign above the head of Lord Nick. He, in his turn, it seemed to Donnegan that the motion was slow, twitched up the muzzle of his weapon and fired once more from his hip. And Big George lurched back on the sand with his face turned to Donnegan. He would have spoken, but a burst of blood choked him. Yet, his eyes fixed and glazed, he mustered his last strength and offered his revolver to Donnegan. But Donnegan let the hand fall limp to the ground. There were voices about him, steps running, but all that he clearly saw was Lord Nick with his feet braced and his head high. "Donnegan, your gun." "Aye," said Donnegan. "Take it then." But in the crisis, automatically, Donnegan flipped his useless revolver out of its holster and into his hand. At the same instant, the gun from Nick's hand seemed to blaze in his eyes. He was struck, a crushing blow in the chest. He sank upon his knees. Another blow struck his head, and Donnegan collapsed on the body of Big George. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An ancient drunkard in the second story of one of the stores across the street had roused himself at the sound of the shots, and now he dragged himself to the window and began to scream, "Murder! Murder!" over and over, and even the corner shuddered at the sound of his voice. Lord Nick, his revolver still in his hand, stalked through the film of people who now swirled about him, eager to see the dead. There was no call for the law to make its appearance, and the representatives of the law were wisely dilatory in the corner. He stood over the two motionless figures with a stony face. "You saw it, boys," he said. "You know what I've borne from this fellow. The big man pulled his gun first on me. I shot in self-defense. As for the other, it was a square fight." "Square fight?" someone answered. "You both went for your irons at the same time. Pretty work, Nick." It was a solid phalanx of men which had collected around the moveless bodies as swiftly as mercury sinks through water. Yet none of them touched either Donnegan or George. And then the solid group dissolved at one side. It was the moan of a woman which scattered it, and a yellow-haired girl slipped through them. She glanced once in horror at the mute faces of the men, and then there was a wail as she threw herself on the body of Donnegan. Somewhere she found the strength of a man to lift him and place his face upward on the sand, the gun trailing limply in his hand. And there she lay, half crouched over him, her face pressed to his heart, listening, listening for the stir of life. Shootings were common in the corner, The daily mortality ran high, but there had never been aftermaths like this one. Men looked at one another, and then at Lord Nick. A bright spot of color had come in his cheeks, but his face was as hard as ever. "Get her away from him," someone murmured. And then another man cried out, stooped, wrenched the gun from the limp hand of Donnegan, and opened the cylinder. He spun it. Daylight was glinting through the empty cylinder. At this the man stiffened, and with a low bow which would have done credit to a drawing room, he presented the weapon, but first to Lord Nick. "Here's something the sheriff will want to see," he said, "but maybe you'll be interested too." But Lord Nick, with a gun in his hand, stared at it dumbly, turned the empty cylinder, and the full horror crept slowly on his mind. He had not killed his brother, he had murdered him. As his eyes cleared, he caught the glitter of the eyes which surrounded him. And then Lou Macon was on her knees with her hands clasped at her breast and her face glorious. "Help!" she was crying. "Help me! He's not dead, but he's dying unless you help me." Then Lord Nick cast away his own revolver and the empty gun of Donnegan. They heard him shout, "Garry!" and saw him stride forward. Instantly men pressed between, hard-jawed men who meant business. It was a cordon he would have to fight his way through, but he dissolved it with a word. "You fools, he's my brother!" And then he was on his knees opposite Lou Macon. "You?" she had stammered in horror. "His brother, girl." And 10 minutes later, when the bandages had been wound, there was a strange sight of Lord Nick striding up the street with his victim in his arms. How lightly he walked! And he was talking to the calm, pale face which rested in the hollow of his shoulder. "He will live! He will live!" Lou Macon was pleading as she hurried at the side of Lord Nick. "God willing, he shall live." It was 3 hours before Donnegan opened his eyes. It was 3 days before he recovered his senses, and looking aside toward the door, he saw a brilliant shaft of sunlight falling into the room. In the midst of it sat Lou Macon. She had fallen asleep in her great weariness, now that the crisis was over. Behind her, standing, his great arms folded, stood the indomitable figure of Lord Nick. Donnegan saw and wondered greatly. Then he closed his eyes dreamily. "Hush," said Donnegan to himself, as if afraid that what he saw was all a dream. "I'm in heaven, or if I'm not, it's still mighty good to be alive." End of chapter 44. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of Gunman's Reckoning by Max Brand.